Hello. Today we're gonna get a little spooky, okay? I've been wanting to read some horror stuff on stream for a while now, and I kind of figured people like the ASMR stuff. So, we're gonna go ahead and try a few new things today, okay? Sorry I look so angry. A woe to you too, blue guy. Big a woe. Let me just go ahead and organize some stuff. Yeah, it's spooky time. Get curled up under the covers, get all cozy with a warm drink, and we'll see how it goes. Why do I look so depressed? That's a blush. There we go. Now we're gonna go spooky to the first creepypasta, Ted the Caver. Well, I mean, it's presumed to be the first creepypasta. First of all, can you hear me okay? Am I coming in loud and clear? And is the background noise too loud? Go ahead and let me know that right now. Just in case. Because I want to make sure you can hear me nice. I want to make sure you can hear me okay. And that the background noise is not overbearing. Because that'd be very much no bueno for nobody. So I'm going to give you a chance to go ahead and let me know that. I'm going to pray to the dear Lord Arceus that I do not sneeze, because if I sneeze right now, that would kind of suck. Roger, Roger, in the background is alright. Fabulous. Okay. Let me go ahead and switch, so I can go ahead and look. Ted the Caver. Dun dun. Caving Journal, 12/30/2000. B and I decided to get in one more caving trip before the new year, so we set our sights on Mystery Cave. Not a spectacular cave, but since neither of us had been caving in a while, it would be nice to go to any cave. There was a bit of excitement to this trip. There was a small passage in the lower portion of the cave that I wanted to check and see if it was possible to get past it. It had a small opening, but lots of air blowing out of it. Even though it was way too small to climb through, I had never even checked to see what was inside of the passage. We got our gear loaded up and hit the road by 3 p.m. We got to the cave in great time. Since B likes to drive fast, we anchored from the usual tree and began to propel into the cave. I went down first and got my gear together while B came down. I will refer to B many times. We've been caving together for many months now. He was injured in a caving accident a few years ago and was told he would never walk again. Through hard work and perseverance, he not only walks, but can get around very well in caves. The trickier parts of a cave might slow him down a bit, but he can make it. He patiently works through an obstacle until he gets past it. As for the reference to the small opening in the cave, there is a saying among cavers: if it blows, it goes. Meaning if a passage has good flow of air, it's probably worth investigating. After we explored all of the usual passages, we climbed down to check the hole. The hole is located deep in the cave, near the lowest part of it. It's on the side of a cave wall, about 3 feet from the floor. To look inside the hole, I had to kneel down to duck under an overhang of rock. I used my backup mini-mag light and held it inside the hole to see what I could see. I was excited by what I saw. The wall around the hole was about 3 to 5 inches thick. It led into a tight passage. The passage opened up just a bit inside the hole, continued back about 10 to 12 feet in a small crawl space. After that, it seemed to really open up, although we couldn't tell how much. And this could be a virgin passage. Obviously, no one has passed through this route, but there could be a way from the other side. To even get to the crawl space, we would have to enlarge the opening. Currently, it's about the size of my fist. Once we get past the opening, we would have a tight crawl back to where it opened up. It would take some work, but we thought we could do it. We sat down for a few minutes to rest and contemplate our plan of attack. While we sat there in the darkness, we could hear the wind howling from the other side of the passage. It was a low, eerie noise. We could also hear a low rumble from time to time. No big deal, though. The cave is in the vicinity of a highway that has heavy trucks drive on it. We figured the rumble was the effect of the trucks resonating through the rocks. We determined that our best plan would be to haul a cordless drill into the cave to drill the rock. Then we could take a bullpen and a small sledgehammer and break up the rock. It seemed straightforward. We'd widen it big enough to squeeze in and see what was on the other side. The efforts to haul all the equipment down to the hole would be a pain, but we hoped it would be worth it. I named the passage Floyd's Tomb, after Floyd Collins. It seemed to look like the tight spot where Floyd spent his last miserable days on Earth. Oh man, yeah, it's the caver. Floyd Collins was a caver back in the 1900s. He got stuck in a tight crawl space and was unable to free himself. It is an amazing story that's detailed in a book called Trapped, the story of Floyd Collins, also in an internet historian video. I think that was the title. I don't recall the author. Calling our passage Floyd's Tomb was not only a tribute to Floyd, but a commentary of the side of the passage. In retrospect, it's funny how simple I thought it was going to be. I figured a few hours and we'd be in. Had I known how long it was going to take, I doubt we'd have even started. If I had known what I was going to experience, I never would have returned. We gathered our gear and headed for the surface. Normally, I couldn't care less if I ever came back into this cave. There's nothing special about it. But now, I was psyched about getting back and getting through. We hadn't even left the cave and I was planning a return trip. January 27th through the 28th, 2001. Ian and I were both excited to get back into the cave and get to work. I figured, with about 4 hours of work, we can be in and see what was on the other side. We arranged to borrow a DeWalt cordless drill to bring with us. We also had masonry bits to drill with, sledgehammers to break up the rock, and bullpins to insert into the drill. And a few other tools. Getting the tools to the work site proved to be a challenge. One of us would climb down, stop at the ledge at a good resting place, then the other person would lower the tools. We kept repeating the routine until we got to the bottom of the cave. Then we had to drag the tools to the hole. It took about an hour to get to work. B took the first turn at the hole. After an hour of exhausting work, we could tell we were not going to get through in one session. We traded off after we worked ourselves into a sweat. One would take a break, while the other went to work. The routine went like this. To begin work, we had to go down on our knees and do our best to avoid smacking our heads on the ceiling. Working in this awkward position would drill into the wall around the hole. That was difficult work. We really had to push on the drill, and it was still slow progress. Then, we inserted the bullpen into the hole and hammered on it until the rock broke up. Then we'd repeat. To give you an idea of how slow it went, the typical size of rock would break off would be around a fingernail size. From time to time, for variety, we would just wail on a cold chisel with a 5-pound sledge. It was slow. The problem was we couldn't take a good swing because of the tight quarters. Even though we spent many hours and several trips working on the hole, we never found a better technique. It gave us the best results for our efforts. We came up with some crazy ideas, everything from TNT to hauling a generator by the mouth of the cave and running an extension cord to a jackhammer. We even thought of using liquid nitrogen to freeze the rock and make it more brittle. After a couple hours of hard work, we realized our limiting factor was going to be. It was about then that our first battery met abrupt death. We had a second battery, so we swapped them out. The second battery lasted a little longer because we hammered and chiseled a little bit more often and a little longer each time. After about 3 more hours of drudgery, the second battery died, and we called it a night. We could tell we had done some work, but it was not much. For the first time since we got to the cave, we sat back, and both of us took a break. It was nice to check out the results of our hard work. But then we noticed the howling again. It seemed to be a little louder than the last time we were there. We just figured the wind was blowing a little stronger outside. What we could not figure out was the rumbling. It too seemed to be louder and more frequent. This time, we couldn't attribute the noise to trucks. The road that the trucks drove on was not very busy to begin with. At that time of the night, it should be dead. Yet the rumbling continued. It seemed to be coming from deep within the passage. B said he would ask some veteran cavers what could be causing the noise. We didn't spend long admiring our work. We still had to haul the gear up and out of the cave. It was difficult work. What made it worse was we were both exhausted. Our original plan was to be done with the cave and hit a couple other caves in the area the next day. Instead, we crashed at a nearby motel. We vibing in the chat? On caving. Before I continue with the next journal entry, I thought it might be helpful to explain a bit about caving and the atmosphere of the cave. As I think about my description, I notice that much of the language I use, or lack thereof, assume that the reader has knowledge of caving and what it's like inside. In other words, I write my journals for me. I'll take this time to give a more detailed summary. The cave was discovered several decades ago, when construction in the area unearthed its entrance. From that time to the present, it's been visited by mostly locals in the area and avid cavers in the region. Beer cans can be found intermittently in the cave, mostly in the upper half. When it was first entered, it was probably beautiful. Dust, graffiti, vandals, pigeons, and regular use have diminished its appeal. There are still places in the cave where small formations remain undisturbed, as a reminder of what the rest of the cave used to look like. To enter the cave, one must have a good length of rope in order to propel down the rock. A nearby tree serves as a good anchor point. Once the rope is tied to the tree, about 20 feet away from a small cliff, it can be tossed over to a small ledge 15 feet below. Once inside the cave, artificial light must be used. My light source of choice is a battery-operated helmet mountain light, known as a TAG light. Safe caving calls for at least 2 sources of backup lighting. I also have glow sticks. They're not considered good sources of backup light by some, but they're good for taking lunch breaks, and they could be used if all the other sources fail. After a short climb over large rocks, the caver comes to a large pit. The same rope is used to reach the bottom of the pit. The drop is only 50 feet or so, but it's not free hanging. In other words, you can't slide straight down the rope, which is preferable. You have to snake your way around sharp rocks as you descend. The ascent is made more difficult for the same reason. The pit varies in diameter from 10 feet to 3 or 4 in a few places. The walls are lined with sharp, white rock called popcorn. Let me correct that. It used to be white, but now it's covered with dust and dirt that was kicked down above by years of caving. The popcorn makes it painful to brush aside the side of the pit. My choice of clothing is levies, t-shirt, gloves, and knee pads. I usually leave the cave with a few scrapes, but at least I'm comfortable while I climb around inside. The temperature is stable year-round, feels cool in the summer and warm in the winter. We've gone in on freezing days, and 10 feet into the cave, it's warm enough that coats are not needed. For this size drop, I usually use a figure 8 descending advice. For the climb up, I attach myself to the rope using a Petzl ascender, but I climb up on my own without using the device. It's there merely as a safety attachment in case I slip. Once the caver gets down to the 6x6 room, they can take a break under a ledge where the rest of the party comes down. Then he must drop to his knees to negotiate a 10-foot-long passage that is only a few feet high. This is where the knee pads come in handy. The floor is covered with a soft dirt, intermingled with bits of broken rock from above. The thin layer of dirt does nothing to soften the blow to the hands and knees as the caver works down the crawl space. As a reward, at the end of the crawl, he gets to drop to his belly and scoot under a tight squeeze. Not really tight, just something low enough to make the caver scoot along in the dirt. Erupt. I am a crazy. I'm honestly really scared of caving, which is kind of funny given I am a geologist. It's called splunking. Once the caver gets to the other side of the squeeze, there are a few feet of crawl space. Then the caver opens up enough to stand. For most of the rest of the cave, they can stand, or at least stoop. The cave splits off into several passages at this point. 2 routes wind around rocks and crevices and come to abrupt dead ends. The other 2 lead to small pools of water. Each route is fun to explore. They all lead on for 100 feet or so in gradual downward slope. Water is a common occurrence in caves. I've been told that one of the local residents was one of the first people in the cave, and that his cousin dove in the pools using scuba gear. He said the cave continued down for a couple 100 feet underwater. What they were hoping for, and what happens frequently, is that the passage comes up somewhere else, with virgin cave passages to explore. At this point, the cave splits into 4 routes. 2 passages that dead end are to the immediate left of the caver. Straight ahead and to the right, the passage leads to pools of water. The entrance to the passage on the right is the largest of the 4. The arched opening rises nearly 10 feet in the air, ending a mere foot below the cave ceiling. As the caver enters the passage, the ceiling gradually lowers until it's about 6 feet high. It continues at the same height for 40 feet, and the passage travels in a continuous direction. This section of the cave resembles a hard rock mine. It's easy to picture rusty mine cars on rail lines and dust-covered miners with blistered hands, gripping dull picks. This time the crawl lasts about 20 feet. The floor is sloping gently downward for the first half of the crawl, and it gets fairly steep and slippery. Able-bodied cavers can still climb carefully down the slippery slope. When I go with B, I carry the end of the rope that we used to get down to this point. I usually need to tie another short ledge of the rope to the first rope to make sure he can use it to reach the bottom. The crawl lasts a few feet beyond the bottom of the slide. Over the next 10 to 12 feet, the caver slowly begins to regain the standing position. After walking a few feet and climbing down a short drop of the cave, the caver arrives at a small level area which has a passage leading down immediately to the left. To the right is a rock wall. Straight ahead is an indentation in the wall that goes back about 3 feet. On the wall, at the rear of the indent, is a small hole about the size of a softball. To get near the hole, the caver ducks under an overhang and kneels upon the rocks that rise above the floor by a few inches. By the time the caver reaches this point, it's either warm or sweating, and the first thing he notices is the cool breeze blowing out of the hole. It was my recognition of this hole as a potential doorway to unexplored portions of the cave that led to this telling of my experiences. As has been my tradition for all the years I've been caving, the party reaches the point in the cave, usually at the deepest part, that all lights are extinguished. Complete blackness fills the eyes. For a moment, the individual caver strains the eye muscles, focusing in and out with the expectation of catching a crumb of light. After several futile moments, the caver turns his head to a sound, perhaps another caver, only to have the other senses return and then heighten. The sounds, smells, and feelings that have been overlooked to this point come racing to the caver in perfect detail. The pain of their own behind sitting on the cave floor, the smell of dust, sweat, the sound of modern material shifting on age-old rock as cavers attempt to find comfort in this solid foundation. At the back of every caver's mind at this time is, what if? What if a person had to climb out of that cave with no light? Would he make it? Would he find all the turns and bends which got him to this place? If not, would a rescue party find him in time? The depth of the darkness recognized at this time is something that's rarely experienced outside a cave. Many first-time cavers erroneously declare that they have to hold their hand to within 2 or 3 inches of their face before they can see it. The truth is, the human eye is incapable of seeing in an absence of light. They did not hear something coming towards them, they would feel it before they saw it. This exercise is a great way to remind people to take backup lighting. As we proceeded to work in the cave, we developed a system pretty early, and little changed in succeeding trips. The first time in the cave, B took first shift, chipping away at the opening. He told me what worked best, and then I would continue doing the same. We would try new things from time to time, but usually stuck to the same method. We would use the masonry bit and press the drill as hard as we could and drill out a hole in the rock. Safety glasses and a dust mask were worn while working. Then we would insert the bullpen and hammer into the rock and break out small chunks of the cave. Then we'd drill another hole and repeat the process. We would work until we became too tired to continue. Then we'd trade. While one worked, the other would remain in the darkness and either eat or drink or just lay down. After just a few rotations, we were tired enough to catch a nap while taking our break. The only light we used was the helmet light on the head of the worker, since it was pointing towards the hole. The resting person was left mostly in the dark. This was a welcome benefit, since the resting person was, well, resting. It was also a chance to cool down a bit, which didn't take long in the cooler temperature of the cave. Fortunately, it allowed us to work pretty hard and not overheat much. I remember that I frequently looked at the hole and thought, hey, it's big enough, I think I can squeeze through. Only to be disappointed at my attempt. However, even after the first attempt and failure, I knew that I would keep working until I got through. This despite the fact I knew it would take many more hours of work. It became an obsession for me. I tried to get out of the cave and work as often as I could. I hoped the passage led to a larger, undiscovered cave that'd be the first ones to enter. I guess the explorer in me wanted to find a new frontier in there. Since B is such an avid caver, he was motivated by the same desire. What we did find was not at all what I expected. February 10th, 2001, and I am taking a drink. For your knowledge, it's apple juice. Scarcely 2 weeks had gone by, and already we were on our way back to work in the cave. We admit we became obsessed with the idea of getting through. That may be a sign of how exciting our lives really are. It's not that we think there's going to be something great. We just like the idea of being the first humans on the planet to set foot in a virgin part of the cave. Although, if we had found hidden treasure, that would be fine with us. We got a late start and drove part of the way in the dark. When I tell people that I go caving at night, they wonder why. They don't stop to think. It's always night when you're inside. All the way out to the mystery cave, we talked about new ideas to speed up our work. He also told me he talked to some caver friends of his that came up with an explanation about the rumbling noise. They thought it might be the sound of water deep within the cave, possibly a waterfall. They couldn't really explain why the noise seemed to come and go. To me, it's just one more reason to get through, so we can solve this mystery. This trip, we took Bee's dog, Whip. She's a Jack Russell Terrier. I was not at all concerned about taking the dog into the cave. We've taken her before. She answers the call of nature before we get in, and then waits until we get out. Also, she's well behaved. We simply had to lower her via a custom-made harness until she reached the bottom of the main drop. Then, she negotiated the rest on her own. She loves to explore, but won't go out of our sight. She doesn't have a light attached to her, so she has to wait for us. Another reason I don't mind bringing her along was because we planned on putting her into a small hole and see how far into the passage she would go. That might give us an idea on what is on the other side. We knew if there was a drop-off we couldn't see, the dog would turn around and come back out. We thought we might have to do some work before even the dog could get through. Despite working in the dark of the night, we were able to rig up and get down pretty quickly. We didn't take as many tools as last time, and we left some in the hole so we wouldn't have to haul them out. I did manage to get 2 more batteries for the drill, for a total of 4. Even with the dog, we made good time getting down. Then something bizarre happened that I couldn't quite explain. The dog began exploring as soon as we left her off the rope. She was in hog heaven, sniffing and darting about around our feet. She would run from one person to the other as we made our way back to the work site. At the point the cave splits into 4 passages, the dog seemed to run out of juice. She stuck right by either Bee or me. That seemed odd. As we progressed further into the cave, she would only stay by Bee. She seemed on edge, like she saw something she didn't like. As we approached the short drop-off before the hole, she stopped, and would only come further after we coaxed her. The hair on her back stood on end. Finally, as we got to within 20 feet of the hole, she began to whimper and hide behind Bee. Her tail was between her legs, and she was cowering down on the ground. Strange. I've seen her square off with dogs twice her size, but now she acted as if Satan himself was lurking in the darkness. I figured there must have been animals that used the cave as home and would have smelled their scent. Too bad it upset her, because there was no way she was going into the passage. We decided with this new development, one of us would work while the other stayed with the dog a few feet away. We got right back into our routine, and with our extra supply of batteries, we were able to really push hard on the drill and not have to worry about using them up. This didn't make the work easier, but it did speed things up. We were on our 4th battery when the second bizarre thing happened to us. Bee was working. He had just finished drilling a hole and was getting ready to hammer through when he stopped and looked inside. I was kicking back, almost asleep, and hardly paying attention. He had a light by his side to illuminate the work area. I could see in the eerie glow a puzzle and intense look on his face. He looked over at me and shook his head. I asked him what was up. He said he swore he just heard a strange noise emanating from the hole. He said it sounded like rock sliding against rock. Sort of a grinding sound. I assumed his ears were just ringing from the drill. He assured me he heard what he said he heard. I didn't have an explanation, so I just went back to dozing. Bee sat in the quiet of the cave for a long time before he resumed work. Also, he'd stop and just listen. I believe he heard something, but I'm not concerned over what it was. I assumed we'd find it once we got through. The final battery lasted another hour or so. We were sitting around, talking about our progress, when I wanted to see if I can get my head through the hole. It fit, but my shoulders weren't. As I was kneeling there contemplating how close we were, I noticed something that we overlooked. The wind had stopped. In all the times I've been in the cave, I've always felt the wind blowing. The last time we were out working on the cave, the wind was blowing worse than ever. Even earlier, we remembered the breeze cooling us off, but now, nothing. He said he didn't know when. The rumbling had ceased too. This plain old cave was becoming mysterious. We talked for a long time in the dark of the cave. We debated what could possibly be causing these unusual events. I think the reason we were sitting in the dark was we were both too hammered to move. We could come up with no reasonable explanation for the strange things happening. After sitting for at least half an hour, we slowly loaded our gear and started for the surface. Whip couldn't have been happier to get out of there. Once again, we left some of the tools behind, just left them in the hole. We made a lot of progress. It helps to have the extra batteries, but we still have a long way to go. In retrospect, I can't believe how casual we were about everything that was happening. At the time, the only thing we could think about was getting in the passage. Everything else was just a distraction. I do recall thinking it'd be nice to get in and see how the cave worked. Now, weeks later, I think of my ignorance and naivete, and I shiver. March 3rd to the 4th, 2001. It took us 3 weeks before we went out again. Our attitudes had changed. In the beginning, we looked at it as a fun adventure. Since then, we began taking a more serious approach. On the drive out this time, our conversation was more subdued than before. We hadn't actually talked much since last trip. And instead of discussing ways to get through the passage, we found ourselves talking about rational explanations for what had happened. Neither of us had any ideas that would explain the unusual occurrences. We were amused to find that neither of us had talked much about the last trip to other people. This was a complete reversal from other trips. It's always been fun to report to friends and family about our progress. Most people have little desires to voluntarily subject themselves to incredibly tight places. Neither do I, but I'll do it to get to the other side. We left early in the afternoon to beat traffic. I don't really recall what time we got to the cave. Like I said, the mood was subdued. We got rigged up and started down. Obviously, B left the dog at home this time. We took essentially the same gear, and we left some of the tools in the hole to save our backs. Even with the gear, we got down in good time. There was only one minor mishap this trip. B scraped his arm on the descent. Not real bad, but he waited until we got all the way into the hole to patch it up. While he was getting the wound cleaned, I started working. We both took note that the breeze was back and the rumbling present. We had 4 fresh batteries and 4 fresh arms. I had high hopes this would be the day. It started slow. When we first started working, the hole was only about 3 inches open, and as we have enlarged it, the thickness has increased. As a result, our progress has become slower. Still, we continued with as much energy as we could. The hole was big enough, at least, for me to put the hammer to the hole for reference. It's been nice to see the pile of broken rock below the hole get bigger and bigger. We both realized that we're just going to have to put in a certain amount of work to get through, so we just get down to business. We don't talk much while we work. Break times are used to chat momentarily about whatever topic pops in the mind. The break takes place whenever the guy that's working decides to switch roles. We both put in some pretty good work sessions. I have a little more stamina than B, but he gets just as much done in a shorter amount of time. We still celebrate the small victories along the way. Whenever a section we've been working on crumbles, we cheer. It's one small piece of Earth that no longer separates us from whatever lies on the other side. I still harbor the fantasy that there's a hidden entrance to the other side of the passage, and years ago Spanish explorers hid the treasures in the cave and sealed the entrance, and it's remained untouched until we find it. B is more realistic, although more mundane. He figures there's more cave on the other side. We'll see who's right. The trip out, I wanted to see if we can speed up the work by using larger masonry bits. I purchased some good ones at the hardware store. One was larger than all the rest. The other was smaller around, but longer. That's what she said. I had pretty much concluded that the big one might be too big, and I was right. We tried to get it to go in the rock, but progress was slow. We tried pushing, and all we got was tired. The larger one created too much friction area for our strength. The longer bit worked fine with our drill. We relied on it for most of the work we did this trip. I thought we were going to be out one bit and a drill on my hand. When the bit broke off toward one end, I was pushing as hard as I could with the bit a few inches from the wall when it snapped. I nearly rammed the drill through the wall from pushing so hard. We were able to retrieve the bit and keep using it, minus a couple inches. It still worked. Only once in a great while did we resort to the hammer and chisel. Work was proceeding as normal until we were on our fourth battery. Oh, you caught my joke. I was kneeling down and working the drill into the wall, slowly. I had earplugs in, safety glasses on, and was lost in my own thoughts. Suddenly, over the squeal of the drill wearing on the rock, I heard a strange noise. It was loud. I could hear it over the noise of the drill, even though I had the earplugs in. At first I thought it was just a drill bit doing its job on the cave. It would frequently complain by screeching and whining as we forced it into the wall. But this was different. It took me several full seconds to comprehend that I was coming from the hole and not the bit. I stopped drilling and yanked my earplugs out just in time to hear the most terrible scream I've ever heard trail off and echo into the darkness of the cavern. I stared wide-eyed at the hole. For several moments I didn't move, nor did I breathe. I turned to look at B. Moments earlier he'd been lying on the rope bag catching a nap. Now he was standing upright, mouth open, with a look of concern on his face. I turned and looked back into the hole, half expecting to see a demon face staring back at me. Nothing was different. I fixed my gaze on the back of the squeeze, where the limits of my lights reached. There was no motion, only darkness beyond the reaches of my light. In the complete silence that followed, I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. Not another sound could be heard in the cave. Suddenly, I heard a scraping noise behind me, and I straightened up. I nearly knocked myself out, hitting my head on the overhang. It was just B, moving to turn on his light, but I was so wired it nearly sent me to the grave. B spoke again, and I jumped. He said to get some rocks and put them in the hole. He explained that whatever animal had made that noise might be able to get through the hole. I immediately grabbed a few rocks and hoisted them through the opening. Using the handle of the sledgehammer, I slid the rocks as far back into the tunnels as I could reach, creating a wall between us and the other side. Since the squeeze is so small, it didn't take long. The entire time I was doing it, however, I was thinking that noise didn't come from an animal. I didn't know if B thought it was, or if he was trying to convince himself. I didn't say anything to him about what I thought. I've tried to come up with some source for the noise. To describe it, I'd say it sounded like a cross between a man screaming in fear and a cougar screaming in pain. It sounded like it came from the hole and was around 100 feet away. The horrific noise reverberated through the cave and through my ears. He estimated the scream lasted 8 to 10 seconds. My best guess is about 5. It's difficult to tell how much time passes when you're listening to a solo from the depths of Hades. After I filled the back of the passage with rocks, we sat there, listening to the silence. My breathing was a lot more rapid than usual. Neither of us spoke for quite some time. Finally, B suggested we get back to work, but to keep an eye for movement. We put an eye in the passage and shined to the back of Floyd's tomb. It was only at this point we realized the wind had stopped again, and the rumbling could no longer be heard. I didn't say anything to B, nor him to me. Back to the drilling. B took over the work, which was fine with me. I wasn't worn out, but I didn't mind being further from the hole. He'd stop from time to time to listen, while I just sat, watching, with my light on. I wasn't close to the entrance, but I still found myself looking behind me, down the passage to the still water. Every time my light would cast an unusual shadow, my heart would jump. My imagination was running wild. Oddly, B seemed to be less concerned about the strange noise than me. After a short time, he seemed to be focused on getting through the passage. I was still straining to listen above the sound of the drill. I heard nothing now, but a familiar sound of carbide on stone. As I contemplated the possible scenarios, I found myself strangely getting somewhat excited again about getting through. It might have been fatigue, or the thought of something valuable. My thoughts were broken when B let out a yell, possibly a cuss word. He said the drill battery was dying, but he hadn't quite broken off a large section he was working on. He set the useless drill aside and picked up a hammer and bullpen. He started wailing away at the hole created by the bit. After nearly 10 solid minutes of hammering, he sat his back against the rock, sweating and nearly out of breath. The bullpen was still protruding from the cave wall, and he held the hammer toward me, inviting me to take a few swings. I held up my hand and shook my head. I'd been ready to exit this cave for a while now, and he didn't press the issue. I was the first to start going towards the top of the cave. Several times I had to stop and wait for B, not because he was moving slow. I was just more than eager to get out. Few times have I felt better than that night, stepping out into the chilly, light air. February 13th, weren't we just in March, what? Yeah, we were, some time travel shenanigans going on here. It's amazing what a couple good meals and a little sleep can do for someone's attitude, even though we still had memories of the strange noise in our minds. We relit our fire of enthusiasm. The other side seemed so close, and we were sure today would be the day. We got to work on the cave and started going down the hole, entering back the darkness and remembering the night before. The sight of the circle of rock illuminated by our headlamps, the smell of dirt in the air, the sound we made as we crawled across the rock. Once we reached the entrance of Floyd's tomb, however, we were once again ready to blaze the trail leading to an undiscovered part of the cave. We immediately noticed the presence of a breeze rumbling through the hole. The bullpen sticking out of its hole was obvious sign of what we needed to begin work for the day. He took over where he left the day before. I took up residence in the same spot. After a mere 2 to 3 minutes, he let out a cheer. He turned to reveal a handful of rock that used to be attached. His breathing was heavy, but he had a big smile on his face. The lower left hand of the corner had been giving us grief because of the thickness of the wall at that point. We felt that if we could just remove that corner, we might be on our way inside. Our excitement consumed us as we examined the hole. I took a hammer and pounded at the surface. The idea was to remove the jagged edges that would take their toll on my skin. The size looked right, now the moment we'd been waiting for. I cautiously approached the entrance to Floyd's tomb. I decided the best way to enter the small hole was to place one arm over my head, turn my head sideways, and slowly work my way in. I soon determined this wasn't going to work. The hole was small, and if I was going to make it without widening it anymore, I was going to have to put both arms over my head in a diving position. turned my head sideways, and slipped into the tomb. The width of the entrance was a limiting factor, but the height was sufficient. The arm overhead position flared my shoulder blades out, but there was still room to get in. Plus, the arms overhead gave me the best squeeze side to side. In order to enter straight into the hole, I stood on my feet and bent over to get level with the entrance. My knees were bent, and the position was uncomfortable. Plus, I had to slightly turn my upper torso to the left in a counterclockwise rotation to negotiate the angle of the entrance. I got my arms through the entrance, with minor scrapes. Next came my head. By keeping it sideways, I was able to get in, for the most part, up to my shoulders. But when I got there, I could feel the rocks touching all around my shoulders and chest. It was not stopping me, but I was definitely scraping many surfaces of my body. I decided to push through, keeping in mind I was going to have to come back out eventually. The pain wasn't too bad, and I was in. Well, my upper body was. At least I could get a good idea of what the tomb was going to be like. I'd like to take a moment to go ahead and point out that this dude probably couldn't get all the way in because his ass was too fat. And looking at the picture that is included in this creepypasta, I believe I am correct. Once inside the tomb, I had a few inches all around me, which to position my body. This was the largest part of the passage, and it was conveniently located right at the beginning of the crawl. That gave me a little room to get positioned to crawl further into the passage. Inside the tomb gave me a whole new outlook of what it was going to be like to crawl through. Even though this was the largest part, it was still small. I could move my head around freely, but every direction that I turned, I was staring at a wall of solid rock. When I spoke to B, my voice sounded muffled, like I was talking in a small box. I could rest my chest on the passage, but the rocks were uncomfortable. I turned my head to look forward ahead, but I couldn't see past. The squeeze toward the end of the passage was closer now, and appeared even narrower. I didn't know if I could squeeze through or not. I knew it'd be close. I wanted to crawl further into the passage. However, I had to work to get some of the looser rocks that were lying out of my way. I was disappointed to find that most of the rocks that looked loose were actually attached to the floor. I was hoping to be able to just scrape them out of the way. I had pushed the sledgehammer into the passage before me, so at this point I used it to push the rocks wall we had made further back into the passage. Then I dragged the sledge back and forth across the floor to move any loose rocks and break up the solid ones. By sliding the head of the hammer under the squeeze, I determined that the narrowest part of the squeeze was about 7 inches high. I figured it would have to do some work before I could slip through. The entire time I had my head in the passage, B was just kicking back, listening to my description and progress reports, and taking a picture of my fat ass. Up to this point, the size of the passage was not too big of a deal. It was an incredibly small passage, but only my upper body was in. And since it was the largest part, and my arms could move freely, I was pretty calm. Then, it was time for a push. I slid the sledgehammer up as far as I could reach. In order to rotate my hips to the proper angle to enter the hole, I had to lean my body on my forearms, use my feet to climb the wall outside the hole, and slowly crawl into the hole. My hips barely fit. Once they cleared the entrance, I could relax a bit and get in position to work towards the squeeze. I decided to try the one arm forward technique to go through. The passage was so narrow that whatever position I started with, I would have to stay with the whole length. There was no room to move around or change. I would also have to turn my head one way or another and keep it there. The crawl was tight. Moving forward, it was relatively easy. I could use my forward arm, my left, to pull and my other to push. At the same time, I'd wiggle my body, trying to arch as much as I could to keep my chest off the rocks. I determined a small flashlight in one hand would be nice. Then I could shine ahead and get a better idea of what I was going to crawl over. This was a difficult maneuver because I had to look overhead, since my head was turned. It became immediately obvious that we were going to have to do more work removing rocks from the passage floor. As I moved along the surface, I was constantly scraping my chest against rocks. I would then have to back up and try to move a rock from the side with my cheek, using a sweeping motion with my head, or back, way out, and move it with my forward hand. My little trip into the passage represented a major milestone in my caving career. When I began caving, I did not feel overly comfortable going through tight spaces. Even the little squeeze at the beginning of this cave was an obstacle to overcome. By pushing myself to try the narrow passage, I have become much calmer about tight spaces. By pushing myself and forcing myself to try the narrow passages, I've become much calmer. Still, it represented a new benchmark in small spaces. I'd never been faced with anything like it, and I don't remember having to take off my helmet before now. Here, it's mandatory. Not only do I have to take it off, but I have to turn my head to the side in order to fit. After I twisted my hips into the passage, I took a few minutes to stop and work out a game plan. Most of the length of my legs were still outside the cave entrance. They were just dangling in the air. The tomb was still big enough to move my head around and even move my arms freely into position. It was larger than the rest of the passage, but not by much. It was like sticking your head in a box. Everywhere I looked, there were rocks, and not too far from my head. Any sound I made was muffled and dead. The narrowest part was 10 feet in, and at this point, I was 3.5 feet in. At about the 4-foot mark, I would have to commit with whatever position I felt comfortable, and stay that way until the 12-foot mark, at which point it would start opening up. I went with my left arm forward and head turned to the right. B had given me a flashlight that I held in my left hand. As I inched forward, I tried to brush the loose rocks away from my arm. It was somewhat successful, but there were many I couldn't move. The first little bit of the crawl moved quickly, and since there wasn't room above me to negotiate the passage, then the wall started to close around me. I had a few extra inches on each side, but the top was getting very low. At about the 7-foot mark, I could feel the top rubbing my back as I would arch. After another half-foot, I couldn't arch anymore. I had to just push ahead with my toes and pull with my forward arm. I decided it would be a good idea to see if I could back out. I tried. It was pretty easy. It gave me a lot more confidence. Still, I had B tie webbing to my feet, just in case he had to pull me out. My neck was starting to get sore from being cranked to the side. My head was getting heavy. But to rest was the only option I had was to lay it down on the broken rocks. It was painful, but I did it frequently. I was staring at the wall to my right. It was a mere 4 to 5 inches from my face. Most of the time I wasn't watching the wall. Either I had my eyes closed, or the light wasn't shining in a direction that did me any good. It was very quiet in the tomb, other than my own breath. I was breathing heavy from the effort it took to move. Thankfully, the breeze was pleasant and cooled me off. By lifting my head and carefully touching the ceiling from time to time, I could gauge the size of the passage that my body would soon pass through. Much like a cat using its whiskers to gauge the opening of a fence, at the 7.5-foot mark, I can tell things were about to get real tight. While lying in the darkness, in a passage deep within the cave, one is in a unique position to ponder. A mountain literally resting on top of me, the entire earth lying below. One tiny movement of earth, and I would cease to exist. Or worse, to recognize the fear shared by Floyd Collins as he lay there, trapped for days deep within the heart of Mother Earth. Incapable of freeing himself from his earthen prison. Picture yourself in my position. Lying on your stomach, your left arm is extended over your head. Your right arm is at your side, having only a few inches in which to move. Your arms and hands are sore and bleeding from crawling, pulling yourself across the broken rocks. Your entire body is resting there. Your neck gets tired of holding your head off the rocks, so you rest your cheek on the rock to rest. and once you start again, you have to push with your toes to scoot forward, sliding across. After a few inches, you are breathing hard and have to rest. As you inhale, you feel your back pressing against the top of the squeeze. It takes several minutes before you recover enough to press forward. The entire time you're lying there thinking about how you're going to get out. And what if? When I reached the point where my back was rubbing, and I could feel my head and the passage was not getting bigger, I knew I was not going to get through. Still, I decided to give it one more push. If I had been in this position a year ago, I'd have been in a state of panic. But not today. I was pumped. I took a minute to rest, then I went for it. I exhaled completely all of the air in my lung. This caused my chest to collapse just enough to scoot forward a few inches. Because it takes so much effort to scoot, I only went a few inches before I had to stop and breathe. As I inhaled, my chest pressed hard against the floor and my back against the top. It took longer to get my breath back. Unbelievably, I did it again. Exhale, scoot, rest. Only a few inches. Repeat. I took a few extra minutes to enjoy this position, pinned in this small passage. I couldn't believe how relaxed I was. I tried one more time to exhale and scoot. My back was rubbing too much to continue. Despite the failed effort, I was psyched. I took several long minutes to lay there and recover from the effort. B had been encouraging me the entire time. Backing out was not too difficult, but it did take some work. I encountered the same obstacles as when I went in. After I wiggled my hips out of the hole, which took some time, I had trouble getting my shoulders out. Both arms were overhead at this point. My shirt was getting caught, and my shoulders were brushing the sharp rocks. After struggling to find a good position, I gave up and pulled my upper body out. Scrape. My shirt pulled up over my head, and I had some nice scrapes on my shoulders. But I didn't care. To me, this trip was a success. I had pushed myself beyond what I thought was possible. I kneeled at the entrance and looked inside what I had just been in. The rock was now at the 11-foot mark. I had pushed it a little with my forward arm. The smallest point was at the 9-foot mark. We were close. Between the work and the excitement, I was tired. I sat on the rope bag, grinning. What a trip. April 7th, 2001. Prior to going back to Mystery Cave, we again spent a lot of time preparing. We made a squeeze box, which is a wooden box, the opening of which can be adjusted in size. You can crawl through the opening and measure how tight of a squeeze we could fit through. From there, we could determine that I needed about 8 inches of height to get through the smallest portion of Floyd's tomb. That meant I would have to scrape out about an inch from the floor of the passage. We also learned the best position would be on my stomach, with my arms by my side, and of course my head would be turned one way or the other. The position allowed my shoulder blades to drop to their lowest point. In order to move, I would push forward or backward with my toes. It sounds difficult, but felt adequate. The second thing we did to prepare was construct the tools we invented to work with. I came up with a clever way to chip away inside of the passage without having to climb inside. I had my neighbor weld together 7 lengths of steel pipe in a manner that would allow us to take it apart while we climbed down the tomb, but still have the strength necessary to hold up a blow from a hammer once it was together. We made our own tips that we could screw into our pipe to reach the area we needed to work on. B came up with a cool design for a scraper using an angle iron. We ended up not using it since B's scraper device works so well. I took an oath. I made a vow. I would not leave the cave until I made it through the passage and conquered Floyd's tomb. This would be the trip. It had been a long time since we'd been out to Mystery. We had been busy, though we had made the tools we talked about. It was fun coming up with ideas for tools. Also, we made a squeeze box to determine the best technique for getting through, and we knew how much rock we needed to remove before we could. We were excited to get out of the cave to finish our project. Our climb down the passage took a bit longer than usual since we had extra tools to carry. Once we got down, we immediately got to work. It worked like a charm, B's scraping tool. We could hammer the pipe on one end and the scraping tool on the other and dig into the rock. Then we could push debris all the way through the passage and out of our way. When we needed to measure our progress, we'd turn it sideways in the passage to deserve the clearance. We worked for about 2 hours before I had a desire to try the tomb. I just wanted to make sure I was going to make it through on the first try. We made one more sweep of the passage floor, clearing any loose rocks from where I'd be crawling, and pushing. I made preparations for the crawl by fashioning a duct tape suspenders to prevent my shirt from sliding around while sliding across the rock. I went with the flashlight in my hand, and even though my hand would be at my side, I knew I would need it once I got through. As an expression of fate, I did not tie a rope to my feet. I was confident I was going to make it, so finally, I made the attempt. Since we didn't do any work to the entrance, I had to get through the same dance routine to enter. Once I got my upper body through, I shined the flashlight ahead of me to work out a plan of attack. The passage didn't seem any bigger than the last time, though most of the work was done deeper in the squeeze. I paused for a few minutes, then twisted my hips to get my lower body in. I slowly inched forward as my entire body slowly filled the passage. Before I was completely in, I got into position. I dropped both of my hands to my side and turned my head into the right, and began to inch forward. Once my toes were inside, I used them to push ahead. To keep my body from scraping, I would walk using my shoulders. Progress was slow, but steady. That was fine by me. A foot or two before the tight spot, I could already tell there was little more room. Even so, I began to touch the roof of the passage with my back. This time, however, I was able to keep moving forward. I reached the lowest point of the passage, and I could tell it was going to be tricky. Even with the work we'd done, I still felt sharp pebbles rolling under my chest as I slid along. When I could feel my back brushing the top of the passage in several places, I reverted to my techniques of exhaling. Before, however, I took a minute to lay there. I could see the glow of Lee's flashlight as the rays of light managed to squeeze past my body. I could feel the cool breeze evaporate the drops of dirty sweat on my forehead. I could feel 1,000 sharp edges dig into the surface of my skin. I felt a twinge of excitement as I realized the goal we had set out to achieve weeks ago was about to be realized. This alone made me keep moving, no matter how tight the passage became. I began. Exhale. Scoot. Stop to catch my breath. Repeat. After just a few inches of scooting, I could raise my head off the floor and squeeze until the passage was beginning to open up. I relayed it to B, and we both took a few seconds to celebrate. During the rest of the slide, B was cheering me on. Virgin Passage and Neil Armstrong territory were the phrases he kept repeating. I was grinning from ear to ear. Even though the passage was getting larger, it was still slow, and I had to continue scooting before I was able to slide my arms underneath me and use them to crawl. At that point, I felt my journey was essentially over. I was able to sit up slightly and move the rock wall we had erected several trips ago. Those rocks served as a somber reminder that a little caution would be wise. I shouted back to B that I was through. We both took a moment to congratulate ourselves on our success. He'd likely never be able to squeeze through the passage and see what I was seeing, so I gave him a description of what it looked like. At this point, I only had a mini-mag, so I couldn't see very far. The end of the passage made a gentle right turn that seemed to go for a ways. I was unable to do anything at this point but sit, due to the size of the passage. All of the rocks we had pushed through Floyd's tomb were around me at that point. There was no other signs of human intrusion. I had to wait until B passed me my helmet to get a better feel for the cave. We used the pole we made to slide me the end of the rope, then I was able to pull all of my gear through and the squeeze. The first thing he sent was my helmet and light, and after that, I was able to see our new section of cave. Hours. It was an exciting experience to see the results of hours and hard work over the course of several weeks. At this point, we still had no idea what it had to offer. The only thing I could see was the passage immediately following the squeeze. It was narrow, with a low ceiling. I'd easily be able to get through it, but I would have to crawl. I began taking pictures so I could show B. I asked him how far he thought I should venture in light of the strange events. For the first time, he too toned down his enthusiasm. He slid the pipe through the tomb with a loosened tip at the end. He said I could use it as a weapon if I ran to an animal, or... He also told me to make sure we could hear each other as I progressed through. I strapped on my gloves and my knee pads and grabbed my camera and began my adventure. I crawled through the passage, which was around 20 feet long. At the end, the cave bent slightly to the right. I would have to climb up the gentle slope, but then I'd be able to stand by the end of the next section of cave. It was 40 feet long. In addition to having a higher ceiling, the walls were a little wider than the section I'd just crawled through. The floor was covered in rock which crunched as I crawled, and then walked across it. The walls were basically the same as much of Mystery Cave, except pristine. It was obvious no one had been there before me. Upon closer examination of the walls, I found two delicate types of formations. The first resembled several chunks of grated cheese tied together on one end, with the rest of the cheese just slipping down. The second formation was just tiny strands of rock, thinner than human hair. It looked pretty cool. I found several examples of both kinds. I was not even in the second section of the cave, and could barely hear B. Cave passages are not very acoustic friendly. I shouted that I would go for half an hour and then return. He said that was fine. I proceeded to explore more, and I could nearly walk upright at this point. I was on the third section of cave when I discovered a crystal formation. It was in several layers of wall, resembling clear candle wax that was allowed to melt and drip down the walls. There were several small stalactite-looking formations formed by these crystals. The longest was about 4 inches in length. There would have been none much longer, judging by the side of the base, but it had broken off. I looked to see where it had ended up, but I couldn't find it. The passage continued on for another 100 feet before it opened. It was the end of a straight segment of the cave. At the very end of the segment, it made a bend to the left and opened into a room. Just at the point where the room was beginning, there was a round rock that appeared to be leaning against the wall. It seemed odd, but singular formations are common in caves, so it's by no means unique. I'd crawled and stepped over several large chunks of rock that fell down from the ceiling, but this one was more round than the others. Once past the rock, the room opened to a height of about 15 feet. It was 15 feet in width? What's a width? It was 15 feet in width and about 30 feet in length, and at the far end, there was another passage leading straight out. As I entered the room, I had an eerie feeling. It was like that old saying that I felt like I was being watched. Once again, the excitement of a new find faded, and the memory of the mysterious side of the cave crept back into mind. I felt very alone. And fortunately for my ego, I was nearly out of time and had to get back to B before my hour was up. I took pictures. I was just going to get a feel for how long the next passage was when something caught my attention. On the left side of the room, at about eye level, I discovered what looked to be hieroglyphics. It was a single drawing that seemed to be a part of the rock coloration. It looked like a very crude representation of people standing below a symbol. This meant there had to be another entrance to the cave. Even if the entrance was closed or blocked, it meant to opportunity to open it and get B inside. I took another look. Then I took more pictures, and I headed back. When I got back to the squeeze, I could barely talk fast enough to let him know everything I discovered. He was just excited to hear. I told him it would be best if we got someone else to come back with me in case something happened. He agreed. And once I got all my gear, I was faced with the task of having to go through Floyd's tomb again. I was a little over halfway through when something bizarre happened. I was laying there taking a brief break when I heard a sound, deep within the cave. It was the faint, but distinct sound of rock sliding on rock. My blood froze in its veins. I couldn't move. I just lay there straining to hear the sound again. Nothing. I began to scoot toward the exit. I didn't mention the sound to B, but I did remember one of our earlier trips when he said he heard the same thing. The task of getting out was as painful as I thought it would be. I definitely left some skin behind as I slipped through, but B helped me as I wiggled my way out. I was out, and I shook B's hand and began to load our gear. I was trying to listen to any sounds coming from the hole, but we were making too much noise. As much as I looked forward to going in, it was a relief to get out. That's how I feel about caves in general. Something strange happened with that picture I took in the new part of the cave. They turned out fine, but strangely none of the pictures taken in the room turned out. Pictures of the round rock, and more importantly, the pictures of the hieroglyphics I saw. Pictures taken before and after the room were great, but those in the room were clear. Nothing. I'm taking a breather. Reading hurts the throat. As much as I am vibing, I hope y'all are vibing. Vibe with me. Vibe with me. I just need to take a breath. April 14th, 2001. Only a couple days passed before B found someone else who wanted to explore the passage. He would not tell them which cave it was to ensure that we explored it to our satisfaction before we made it known in public. Even the guy who ended up going with us didn't know which cave it was until we were close to it, and he was sworn to secrecy. I won't identify him by name, so I'll just refer to him as Joe. Joe, B, and I set out early in the morning to make sure we could spend all the time we wanted in the new passage. When we got to the cave, we were able to rig up and descend quickly. It helps when you don't have to haul half the hardware store down into the cave. Joe is a rather thin caver who's had a lot of experience. He said this might be the tightest squeeze he's been in, but it didn't bother him. He knew physically he could make it, since I was bigger than him and I made it. He was just excited to get through. He quickly got ready and was waiting to hear the plan of attack. I figured I'd send him through first, and then we'd follow. It was perhaps irresponsible of us to not tell Joe about all the unexplained events that occurred in the cave until after he'd gone in. I couldn't believe how easy Joe slipped through the passage. He said it was tight, but it sure didn't look like it. Once he got in, we passed him his gear, then I started in. Even though I knew I could fit through, it was still a slow trip. You can only go so fast when you're scooting with your toes. When I reached the tight spot of the squeeze, I had Joe snap a picture of me. Once I got through, B started to relay my stuff to me. Then, disaster struck. I had gone all the way in and turned around to pull my gear through. I had to kneel and crouch. I just got my helmet and light. I was turning around to feed the rope back to B when I smacked my head on the top of the passage. Human skull versus solid rock. Rock won. I told B what happened, so he sent me a first aid kit through. I was bleeding, but I didn't feel good. I patched myself up, then told Joe I couldn't continue. He looked like a little kid who was told Christmas would be cancelled. I didn't like the idea of him exploring the cave without me. I wanted to at least see part of the cave for making the trip out there. I told him how far to go and how long it would take, then I sent him on his way. His light disappeared after the first turn, and I rested a minute or two. Then began my journey back through the squeeze. It was disappointing to get all the way to the cave and not be able to explore it. Actually, it was killing me. After I got out, I sat and munched on the Cliff Bar while B and I chatted. I told him I'd pay for a motel room if he'd stay overnight. Then we could see how I was doing the next day and make another attempt. I felt goofy for having smacked my head on the cave wall, but B said he was willing to give it another try. As long as Joe would stay overnight, we determined to wrap things up the next day. Once this was settled, we sat back and enjoyed the darkness. We could hear no sounds coming from the passage. The silence reminded me of the scraping noise I heard last time we were out there. I brought up the subject with B. Since I had not explored the cave completely, I couldn't offer any explanation of what could be making the noise, or the change in the wind, or the rumbling, or that scream. And suddenly, we both wished we hadn't sent Joe in alone. B ran in and yelled into it, "Joe!" No answer. You can't hear each other when you're very far apart. The 20-minute time limit we had set passed, then 25. I had no desire to climb back through. My head was still throbbing. Still, I knew I was going to have to make sure Joe was safe. Just as I was getting prepared to go back through, I saw a light deep in the passage. "Joe?" I called out. "Joe!" Still no answer. The light got brighter, and I could hear the noise of someone crawling through. "You okay, Joe?" "No," was his weak reply. When we got to the other side of the tomb, he said he was not feeling well. He quickly took his gear off and put them in the bag so we could pull it through. As I pulled the bag through the passage, he began to climb through the tomb. We didn't get a chance to question him before he was coming back through. He slipped through the squeeze and the hole, and we got a look at him. He looked terrible. His face was pale and he was out of breath. The dust that covered the floor of the squeeze left its mark on his face and clothes. He had numerous small cuts and scratches on his face and arms. His eyes were open wide. We only had a brief moment to look at the change before he started to head up out of the cave without saying a word. While they headed to the surface, I took a second to get our gear. Then I stopped to listen into the passage. I heard nothing, and I felt nothing. The wind had stopped. Part of me wanted to get out of the cave as fast as possible, but another part wanted to immediately climb through the passage to find out what made the cave tick. Then was not the time, though I still felt a little dizzy from my injury. At that moment, I noticed B and Joe made good time getting up the cave passage, and I was left alone. Chills ran through my body as I scurried to catch up with them. I'm trying so hard not to sneeze. Once we got outside the cave, I figured we'd be able to find out more from Joe. But when he got up the final climb, he just unclipped from the rope and went straight to the truck. In the light of day, he looked even worse than in the cave. B and I gathered up the rope and our gear and headed for the truck. Joe said he didn't want to stay overnight because he felt terrible, so we'd headed home. We couldn't get any information from Joe. He just stared straight ahead. He was shaking like a leaf, and he said he was not cold. When we tried to question him, his answers were short. I asked him if he saw the hieroglyphics. No. Did he hear us yelling? No. Did he see the round rock? No. Did he see the crystals? No. He said he just went a little way in and felt sick. Something felt fishy about his answer. He would have had to see the crystals. But if he was that far, he couldn't hear us yelling. But why would he not elaborate? As we were dropping him off, we asked him if he wanted to go back into the cave. He shook his head and ran into his house. I tried to call him later, and the next day, but I only ever got his voicemail. We vibe with that, you take that breaks, thank you. April 28th. 2001. The cave represented to us the culmination of weeks of hard work, complete with an array of emotions, from fatigue to fear. To us, we were not standing on the brink of possible destruction, but honoring an unspoken commitment. Much like a parent of a wayward child, we were not about to abandon our child out of fear of the unknown. Like it or not, this cave had become a part of us, and we had to see the adventure to its fruition. Additionally, verbose explanations aside, we were being eaten alive with curiosity. Despite the overwhelming number of unexplained occurrences we experienced, we had to go back to this cave. What could have possibly happened to Joe? What did he see or experience? We kept coming to the same conclusion, that we had to return to the cave. The only way we could hope to complete the puzzle was to conquer it. We were going back. 2 weeks after our trip with Joe, we were back on the cave. To prepare, we contacted a local cave rescue group and got permission to borrow their low-voltage two-way phone. The phone consists of two transceivers and a long spool of wire. I would then be able to unwind the wire as I went into the passage and stay in contact with B the entire time. We also thought it'd be a good idea to take a video camera. I purchased a case that would protect it from dust as well as sharp rocks. I was more than willing to pay the cost just to make sure B got to see the whole passage. My head was doing fine. I still had a red mark. I never went to a doctor, but it was very painful. I have thought about what would have happened if I'd been able to go with Joe. He was a changed man after he came out. I've been calling his house nearly every day trying to talk to him, but he won't answer his phone. B called his work, and a mutual friend told him that Joe called in sick 2 weeks ago and hasn't been seen since. He said Joe warned his boss he might be out for a while. I even stopped by the house twice. The first time, it looked like somebody was home, but no one answered. The second, his car was gone and there were no lights on. I hoped to talk to him, but it didn't work out. Right from the beginning, it seemed the cave did not want us to be there. Nothing went smoothly. Every time we tried to clip a carabiner or a tire knot or attach to something, we had to do it 2 or 3 times to get it. Fortunately, we recognized it and make sure everything was safe and secure. As we made our way down, we were continually bumping into the side of the cave, or stumbling as we walked, or dropping things. We finally reached a point where we stopped to gather ourselves before continuing. Our load was relatively light, but we were taking forever to get through. Finally, we made it. The trip through Floyd's tomb went smoothly, figuratively speaking. After I got through, we took several minutes to get everything passed through to me. I got suited up and tested everything. The phone worked, I videotaped the squeeze, and then the first section of the new passage. Since I was going to be unable to tape while I crawled, my plan was to crawl to the next section, stop, and film more. I could get video where I had just been through, and then the video where I was going to next. That way I could get the section from both ends. I was feeling good. I felt a sense of satisfaction about being able to provide a way for B to see the fruits of his labor. It was awkward lugging the camera and unrolling the phone while trying to crawl, but I knew it'd be worth it. The small formations were too small to show up on video. With normal outside lighting it would be no problem, but with my headlight, it was futile. The crystal formations turned out quite nice. They were large enough and made for some good footage. I took advantage of the film stop to check the phone. It was comforting to hear someone's voice from within the passage, and we chatted briefly, then unplugged, and prepared to continue. The phone resembled an oversized regular phone, or like the ones you'd see in war movies. When I wanted to talk to B, I would just plug the phone into a special jack of the spool of wire. The power source was on his end, so it was always on. The reception was as clear as a normal phone. I continued forward. Even though progress was slow, it was steady. Things were going pretty good until I reached the round rock. Once again, I got a strange feeling, just like last time. I looked around carefully but saw nothing. I got good shots of the round rock of all angles. the walls, the ceiling, and the floor, and some tape of the figure of the wall. It was difficult to make out what it was on video, but you could see something was there. After everything was to my satisfaction, I moved towards the end of the room to prepare my new territory. At the edge of the room was a passage that led to darkness. The entrance was about a foot lower than my head, and it looked like it continued at the height as far back as I could see. I ducked under the ceiling and prepared to see new sights. The walls of the passage were darker than the rest of the cave to this point. The floor was made up of the same type of broken rock, with the ceiling having the same perfect arch as the old section of Mystery Cave. It almost seemed out of place in the jagged atmosphere of the cave. I could only see back 30 or so feet, where the passage appeared to make a right-hand turn. I thought it'd be a good place to check in with B. It took a couple of beeps before he answered the phone, but once he did, his voice was still crystal clear. He said he was doing fine and that I could take as much time as I needed. I thanked him and hung up. He spent a lot of time just waiting for me while I explored. I was glad he was still willing to sit and wait. From behind me, I heard a scraping noise. It was loud, and it was close, and it was coming from the large room I had just left. I wheeled around to face what had made it, and when I did, I lost my presence of mind and stood up at the same time. Crunch. My helmet crashed into the passage ceiling. My light broke, and I was buried in the heavy darkness. Pain shot through my neck and down my back. The helmet had protected my head, but my neck was nearly numb from the impact. Fear enveloped me, and my knees began to weaken. I slowly and involuntarily slumped to my knees. I gently sat the camera down as I began to see stars from the pain in my upper back. The scraping noise lasted only a second, and now the only sound I could hear was my own panic-inspired breathing. Not only could I feel the fear thick upon my chest, but the darkness seemed to hold me in place. I felt like I was vulnerable from every direction. I wanted to turn and look behind me, and to the side of me, and in front of me. Everywhere I looked, I saw black. I broke the stupor of terror long enough to reach for an alternate light source, the mini-mag on my helmet. I twisted the light to turn it on, and when I did, I nearly cried. I forgot to push fresh batteries, and now I can barely see more than a few feet. It was better than nothing. I immediately began shining the light with all my light into the large room. I strained to get a glimpse of movement, and there was nothing. My mind was not thinking clearly. I honestly thought I was going to die right there in the cave. For a fleeting moment, I wondered how B would ever figure out what happened. Then it hit me like a boulder. The phone. My mind must have been clearing up at that point, because I also thought of my glow sticks. Without taking my eyes off the large room, I felt around my pack for the sticks. Since I was carrying the phone and video camera, I moved as much as possible from my pack, and one of the things I left with B was my backup headlamp. Thus, I was left with only the glow sticks. I found one and ripped it out of the package. I could tell something was wrong by how it sounded. It had been invertedly broken and was now useless. I chucked it on the ground and searched my pack for another one. I took my eyes off the large room only to check the passage behind me occasionally. I found another glow stick, broke it to light it up. The soft green glow created eerie colors on the walls of the cave. The stick provided barely enough light to see the immediate area, and provided no hint of what lay ahead. I felt the pack for one more light, again without taking my eyes off the room. I felt a third glow stick and ripped it out of the package. After breaking it, to make sure it worked, I hesitated, then threw the glow stick into the large room. The throw was a perfect one, and the sticks sailed through the length of the room. In the brief moment that the light traveled, I saw nothing but cave. The absence of anything did nothing to ease my state of panic. At the far end of the room, I got a brief glimpse of the round rock as the light bounced on it. Then, the light went behind the rock and seemed to disappear. I was still shaking, but I didn't see anything. But there was the noise. I used the glow stick to light the phone, and with fumbling fingers, I managed to plug it into the jack. I put it to my ear and heard nothing. The usual beeps to indicate a connection with the other phone were not there. Terrified, I pulled the phone from the jack and reinserted it. Silence. The line was dead. I had just talked to B. I found myself nearly sobbing with fear. I knew the only way out of here was back the way I came, but something was there. A third attempt, making contact with B, met with the same results. I tried to think of another plan, but could only focus on the memories of the grinding sound that I had heard in my weakened state. I slumped against the side of the passage, breathing like I had just finished a race, never breaking eye contact with the shadows of the larger room. As my shoulder touched the wall, I had a powerful jolt of pain. Despair, agony, terror. I can't say how long I sat there, but my feet were tingling and my knees were sore. The pain in my back crept lower, although my neck felt no different. I resolved to make an attempt to exit this evil passage. I knew if I waited too long, I would lose what little light I had. I attempted to stand, but did not have the strength. I crawled slowly to near the end of the large room, dragging my pack beside me. Using the walls of the cave, I was able to slowly stand, though not straight due to my sore back. Still breathing rapidly, I slowly advanced through the room. I wound up the phone wire as I went. My eyes were staring straight ahead, straining for any signs of movement. With every step, my light would cast changing shadows on the wall, keeping me busy trying to look at everyone. My eyes burned as I realized I had not blinked for many minutes. Like me. How many? How long had this been going on? The only sounds I could hear were the crunch of my feet on the broken rock and the wheezing of my breath. As I wound the cord, I could hear the squeak of the wheel, with each turn bringing me closer to the tomb, closer to B, closer to safety. As I passed the crude drawing, it seemed to glow, as if offering some sort of warning. I didn't know what the drawing represented, but everything about this cave seemed to instill fear. Toward the far end of the room, I could see the rock, dimly, at the far reaches of my light. Something seemed different, but I couldn't tell what. When I got within a few feet, I could finally tell what had changed. It had moved. That was the sound I heard. Again, terror gripped my entire body as I realized how close I was to something. I had no choice but to continue, but it was not easy. I inched toward the rock, holding the glow stick ahead of me in a shaking hand, using it to pierce the darkness. I stopped just at the side of the rock and wound up the slack in the phone wire. Then I realized why I lost contact with B. The rock was now sitting on the wire. I gave it a tug, and the thin wire snapped. My only hope of contact with the outside world ceased to exist when that wire broke. I've never felt so alone and helpless, buried deep within the earth. I'd voluntarily descended into my own grave with a casket of solid rock. With the phone now useless, I sat in the passage, my gaze fixed on the round rock. I proceeded forward. My breathing was rapid, with my throat dry and aching and my mouth dusty. With every crunch of the rock below, my feet, my heart seemed to stop. No movement could be seen in the green glow of my stick. I got to the rock and peered over the top. Seeing nothing, I took steps past it. When I reached the other side, I recoiled in horror at what I saw. In the side of the passage, near the floor, was a hole, with another passage revealed. It had been covered by the rock, but now it was exposed, and the rock could not have moved by itself. I backed away from the hole and collided with the opposite wall. I hadn't been paying attention to the pain in my back, and now it came back to me with all its fury. I stared down at the newly discovered passage. It went down at a 45-degree angle and continued straight as far as I could see. Several feet down, I could see the glow stick I had thrown. It illuminated the passage enough. I could tell the walls were smooth. The floor seemed to be the same way, unlike the rest of the cave. The passage was about 3 feet in diameter, as far as I could see. It would be easy to explore if I had the desire to do so. Right now, I wanted out of the cave and into daylight. I slowly backed away from the hole toward B. I never took my eyes out of the abyss. I nearly tripped over the phone wire as I turned to leave this devil's lair. I noticed my mini mag was practically dead, leaving me with only the glow stick. I wanted to sprint to Floyd's tomb. Just hearing another human being would help alleviate some of the fear I was experiencing. As I turned away from the large rock in the hole, I felt an overwhelming sense of panic fill me. It felt like a legion of demons were about to attack me from behind. I felt like salvation lay ahead of me in the darkness, and Lucifer was behind me, trying to keep me from safety. I found myself moving faster than I should have been in that cave. My only thought was to get out as quickly as possible. I passed the crystal formation, barely even noticing it in the green glow of my light. Every time I ducked to avoid a rock, I felt my back scream its reminder of my injury. When I got to the point of the passage where I had crawled, I flung myself on all fours, barely slowing down as I dropped. When my hands came into contact with the cave floor, I felt an electric shock shoot all the way down my back, and simultaneously down my arms. For the first time since this nightmare began, I let out a scream. I crumpled down and lay there on the rock, with new levels of pain manifesting every time I inhaled. Whimpering from fear and pain, I tried to listen to any other noise. I could feel silence pounding in my head. I knew from experience that B was out of earshot, but I was close. Forcing myself to move, I winced as I pulled my body on all floors and started moving against the cave. I still had the glow stick, but I had ceased checking behind me. Now my focus was ahead of me. I reached the point where I could yell to B, but I didn't make a sound. I didn't want to stop long enough to talk. I reached the last stretch of the cave before the squeeze, and as I was crawling towards the beginning, I called to B, and he answered back. I screamed to get everything ready to go. He asked if I was okay. I told him no, and to get everything ready to go. When I reached the rope, I flipped off my helmet and shoved it in my pack. For the first time I realized I had forgotten my video camera. It was a fleeting thought. I cared no more about it than a passenger of the Titanic cared about a hat or a coat. I tied the pack to the rope and told him to pull it through. Then I told him to start heading to the surface as soon as he pulled the rope through. He asked why, and I screamed there was something in the cave with us. My back ached with every move I made. I knew it didn't matter, though. I was getting through the tomb as fast as I could, injuries notwithstanding. Just as I stared into the squeeze, I felt the wind in the passage increase, and with the most nauseating stench I have ever experienced. It smelled like damp, rotting, rancid, putrid death. I almost started to dry heave. I pulled my shirt over my nose to shield me from the overpowering smell. At this point, B smelled it too. He yelled, "What is that?" Then he yelled at me to hurry up and get through. I told him I was coming. Then I took a deep breath through my shirt and started back through. B's yelling had intensified my fear and panic, as if I needed any help. I knew he could sense the urgency in getting out of this place. Still, as I worked my way through, I yelled at him to start up, that I would catch up with him. He said he would. He placed my glow sticks inside the passage, then I began to climb out. This time through the squeeze, I had no regard for the tightness of the passage. I was scraping my face, ears, arms, and shoulders. Every inch meant numerous scratches on my body, but I barely noticed them. My back was nearly paralyzing me with pain. Once again, I felt the rising need to vomit because of the stench. Halfway through, I took a breath. I was approaching exhaustion, and my respiration was through the roof. The top of the passage seemed to rest my cheek, and the floor felt like broken glass on the opposite. As I paused briefly to recuperate, I heard the scraping noise coming from deep within the cave. It continued for several seconds, then silence. I let out a cry which startled me. I was no longer consciously reacting. The cry was a subconscious response to the fear. In a panic, I began to scoot through the passage. As I reached the largest part, I slid my arms under my body to get into position to exit. I grabbed the rope and pulled with all my might. When my shoulders reached the hole, they lodged, and I was stuck. I dug my feet into the rocks and wiggled my way back. Then I turned my body and tried again. This time, I was successful in pulling my upper body through. Normally, I'd carefully work my way out, but since there was a 3-foot drop on the outside of the hole. This time I kicked with my legs and pulled my arms, and plop, I dropped out of the tomb, right on my shoulder. I tried to roll to soften the impact, but I could only take it. Strangely, the pain was focused on my shoulder, apparently not affecting my already sore back. I rolled over on all fours, then slowly rose to my feet. The smell was much less intense outside. I grabbed the glow stick and used it to find my helmet. I began to head for the webbing to climb up, while strapping the helmet on. When I got the webbing, I reached to grab hold and recoiled in horror. The glow of the glow stick, I could see for the first time the injuries to my arms. My forearms were covered with deep cuts and scrapes. Much of my arm was covered in blood. The wounds were not deep enough to bleed freely, but rather oozed the blood. In the moment that I stopped, I noticed there was silence in the cave. No sounds coming from the passage, and nothing from up ahead. Once again, the feeling of being alone returned, motivating me to proceed. Climbing up the little drop proved to be difficult in my condition. Having the glow stick as the only light source added to the challenge. Once on top, I scrambled to catch up with B. I was impressed with the speed of his ascent. I did not see or hear B until I reached the small area at the bottom of the drop. He was on the rope and climbing out as fast as he could. I could hear him moving quickly and breathing heavily. I called out, and his startled reaction showed he was as tense as I was. He told me to get climbing. We both knew that would be dangerous and not something we'd ever normally do. But this was different. I stood there looking up the rope, disappeared into the darkness above me. He danced around as B made his way to safety. He was out of sight, but I knew he was close. I knew the rope was my lifeline to the outside, to the light of safety. Behind me was darkness, fear, the unknown, and the fleeting thought of a movie scene where the actor had outwitted a monster and reached the front door of the haunted house. Just as he reaches for the knob, he hears a sound behind him and turns, only to see... I slid the glow stick into the cord of my helmet and reached for my harness. Then I thought I would let B get a little higher while I pulled the rope up that was stretched down into the cave. It'd make it easier to get out once we got to the top. I chose not to wind it around my arm, since it was sore and bleeding, so I just pulled it into a pile on the floor. From above, I heard B warn me, "Rock," and I ducked under the ledge as several small rocks landed on the floor beneath my feet. I quickly went back to pulling the rope in. I had about half of it, about 50 feet, when the rope hit a snag. It was solid. There was no way out. There was no way I was going to crawl back in to release it, so I decided to just forget it and get my harness and get out. I quickly threw the harness around me and started to buckle it, but before I could secure it, I heard a strange noise at my feet. My pulse began to quicken. I looked down at the rope only to discover my horror that the rope was disappearing down into the darkness. Something was pulling the rope back into the cave. I let go of the harness and began clawing my way up the rope. The unbuckled harness fell to the floor. Fortunately, I held on to the ascender. At that moment, I couldn't think straight and began climbing out of the cave without being attached to the rope. I was climbing as fast as my battered body could haul me up. I was in a near panic state and consequently was scraping, bumping, and gouging my arms and legs. As I climbed, I screamed to B that something was pulling the rope. He yelled to hurry. Lucky I didn't slip and fall. If I had, I would have bounced several times against the side of the cave before smashing on the floor. The injuries would be fatal. Without the necessity of having to stop or slide the ascender up the rope, I made excellent time getting up. I could see rays of light above me, coming from the entrance to the cave, that told me where I was. I cut up to B on the ledge, below where our relay point was fixed. I told him to keep going. It would only take him a few minutes, but every second would be torture, because I had to wait for him to get up. I watched the rope that we had just climbed. I expected to see some creature from deep within the earth up and make me its lunch. The rope moved a bit, in rhythm with B's climbing, but didn't appear to have any tension. As I stood there waiting for B, I kept watching it for any signs of anything bizarre. I didn't know if my heart could take any more stress. I could not have been well wired. I tried to relax a bit to make sure I was thinking rationally, but my poor brain had reached sensory overload. As B reached the top of the last climb, I got ready to clip my ascender and get my sorry ass out of there. It was then that I noticed the rope began to tighten from below. I could feel the tension, but it was steady, not like something was climbing up. Either way, I wanted out of there as fast as possible. I climbed up and scrambled up the rope. I hadn't noticed, but B had kept moving towards the entrance. I got up the last few feet in a hurry. I just unclipped and kept moving. By the time I got to the entrance and daylight, B was almost up to where the rope was anchored. I wanted to get up so bad I almost started to free climb without clipping on the rope. I could see B was almost up, so I clipped on and started. I almost didn't make it. I had just started when I nearly collapsed from exhaustion. I managed to recover enough to pull myself up the last few feet. As I climbed, I could hear the tension on the rope manifest itself by a stretching noise in the rope. I prayed it wouldn't break with me attached to it. The second I reached the top, I unclipped the ascender. I could see B kneeling down by the tree, so I limped over to him and collapsed. For the first time, we could see each other. We just stared. I knew I looked bad, but I didn't know that B was in such bad shape. He had cuts and scrapes on every exposed surface of his body. His face was pale, almost white. His mouth and his eyes were wide open. He was breathing heavily, almost gasping. The shock we shared at the other person's appearance was broken when we heard the rope around the tree stretch, and the knot B had tightened. I was frozen in place, overwhelmed with fright. B seemed to be transfixed on the knot. Then in one motion, he produced a pocket knife and began to work on the rope. It's amazing how a person's state of mind can alter the perception of time. I'm sure it only took 4 or 5 seconds to sever the rope from the tree, but it seemed like an hour. When the rope was cut, the knot fell to the ground, while the rope zipped across the rocks and over the edge of the cliff, the speed of it causing a humming noise as it went. As soon as the rope was cut, B let out a cry. He dropped the knife and fell backwards. Watching the rope fly over the edge brought feelings in the passage back to me. I got up and headed towards the truck. I noticed B was still laying there, wide-eyed, staring at the point the rope disappeared. I called to him, which seemed to break his trance. He got up and hurried away from the tree, the cave, the nightmare. Neither of us said a word all the way home. Sorry, I just had to take a breath. But we're almost done. It has been 3 weeks since our last visit to the cave. I want to update everyone as to my condition, my plans, and the events. I'm sorry for not returning your calls. I've been getting your messages, I just haven't felt like responding. I figure if I can get this site updated, I can let everyone know about how I'm doing. A lot has happened, so I'll do my best to cover everything. I guess I should start where my last entry left off. It took several days to get the entry written. I was so shocked I couldn't really do much. Right now I'm on long-term medical leave from work. I'm about to sneeze. I'm trying not to sneeze. I've even been to the doctor, but I couldn't tell him about the experience. So I told him I was under a lot of stress. He recommended rest and gave me a prescription to help me relax. Drugs. When we left the cave, I was in a state of shock, and I couldn't think clearly. I didn't eat much, or did I get any sleep. I was glad I had the presence of mind to write my experience while it was fresh. As I reread what I wrote, I feel like I accurately portrayed what happened. I wouldn't change anything I wrote, even though it took 3 days to write it. When I finished writing, I felt better. It felt therapeutic, but it didn't last. B and I parted company after the trip, and I didn't see him again since yesterday. I didn't try to reach him, and he didn't try to get a hold of me. Neither of us tried to contact Joe. B just dropped me off after the trip, and I spent the next several days by myself in my house. I tried to eat but had no appetite. I was restless, but I couldn't take my mind off the experience. The day after I had that overwhelming feeling of anxiety sink into my soul, I was depressed and confused and had no one. I was getting all kinds of calls from people, but I let the answering machine take it. I even changed the message on the machine to let everyone know I was alright. I continued in this state, eating and sleeping whenever I could manage until a week after the trip, things started to get strange. At first, I was hearing sounds that had no explanation: footsteps, shuffling noises, doors, the typical horror movie fare. But the sounds weren't distinct, and I didn't know if I ever heard what I thought I heard. The sound wouldn't repeat itself, and if it wasn't for the fact it happened frequently, I couldn't be sure it happened to begin with. I was scared. I felt like I was caught in a spider web for the last week. Feelings of anxiety, foreboding, tension filled my life. Then came the hallucinations. I began seeing things similarly to the sounds I was hearing, just glimpses of something in the corner of my eye. When I'd look, nothing. I'd been sleeping with the lights on in my room, but I kept everything on from dusk to after dawn. When I started to see things on a regular basis, I purchased a gun. I went to the doctor, but I didn't mention all the details of my life, just that I couldn't relax. Fortunately, my wounds and injuries were pretty much healed by this time. My back still hurt, but the prescription took care of it. Unfortunately, the severity and sightings increased, giving more of a need for the medication. The flashes out of the corner of my eye continued, but then I began to see shapes and shadows. They'd be outside my window, usually at night. I couldn't make anything solid, and it was hard to tell what I was seeing. My daily routine was mechanical and empty. I would sleep in as long as I could. Then I would get cleaned up and try to eat. I lost a lot of weight, so I always tried to get as much possible down. I'd exercise and nap a lot. I've only been out of the house a few times. The store, the doctor, the gun purchase. I didn't watch much TV. I couldn't concentrate, so I spent a lot of time on the internet. I was doing research on caves and cave myths. The only story I could find was the caver folklore about the Hodag. It's supposed to be a creature that roams caves. 2 weeks after the cave incident, I began to have nightmares. Very lucid nightmares. No specific theme or reoccurring events, just terrifying. Sometimes I was in my house and something was trying to get me, or I couldn't run, I had no legs. Or I was in a vat and something was pouring syrupy liquid on me, filling it. I'd wake up in a panic and stay awake until I fell asleep again. It was brutal and continued for several days, until yesterday. My dreams seem so real, I've had a hard time of telling I was awake or not. I was going from the living room to my bedroom in the early evening when I looked down the hall and saw a dark figure at the end. I thought it was a thief, but it didn't move. And as I was backing up, the lights flickered off and on. Every muscle was tense. I stopped and stared at the figure. The phone rang. It startled me so bad I stumbled over the chair. When I got up, I wheeled around, looked down the hall, and nothing was there. I left the house. I felt compelled to drive. My pulse pounded as I got in and started through the car. I wanted to drive to the overlook to see the city lights. I didn't know why, but I had to go. And the closer I got, the more urgent it felt. I saw something that at first startled me, but then helped me relax. It was Joe. He was out of his car, standing, looking at the lights. We looked at each other, and I could see he'd been going through the same miserable trial I had been. Our conversation was brief. "You been back?" he began. He knew the answer. "Yeah, we need to return. Tomorrow good?" I asked. "Yeah, noon." He got in the car, and I got into mine. I hadn't wanted to talk to him about his experience, and he didn't want to know mine. I drove to B's. When I drove to B's and opened the door, he looked like he was fine. One look at me and his disposition changed. Our conversation was also short. I ran to Joe and we're going back tomorrow at noon. B looked dead serious. He just nodded his head. I asked if I could spend the night, and he let me in. I didn't notice until later, but every light was on. He led me to his spare room. I washed up in the bathroom. I took some medication and got the first decent sleep in a long time. I woke up and came home to get ready for the trip. I thought I would send out this update so no one would wonder what happened with me. I expect that by the time the most of you read this, I'll be back at home and we'll have a great story to tell. I promise that if you haven't heard from me by now, you will shortly. It's 10 a.m. on Saturday the 19th. We'll be leaving for the cave in 2 hours. This will be like no trip I've been on. For the first time in my life, I'm carrying a gun to a cave, along with a knife, a first aid kit, plenty of food and water, and a camera. I'm going to take several sources of light, and a pad of paper and a pencil. I've taken all of my climbing rope. I will carry a good length with me on the other side of Floyd's tomb. There are many things I hope to accomplish, answers I hope to find. Was this all a bad dream? I'm wide awake, and still, in a few short hours, I might face my nightmare. The thought of having another person in the passage does nothing to alleviate my fear. I almost chuckle as I ponder a childish notion that we'll have to consider. Who will enter first? Who will lead the way into the dark unknown? Who will decide when to turn back? Darker questions follow. What if the camera is gone? What if it's destroyed? Although it's difficult to put an exact name to my motivation, closure fits nicely. I need to find a few things of the cave. I need to find the end of the cave. With all of the bizarre things I witness, it would seem a bit trite to want, but it's a primary goal to get through the end. It's what I want. To be sure, I'll be seeking out any other bits of knowledge I can find. If I find the end of the main passage and an end to the passage hidden by the rock, I'll be content to never return to the cave again. Never. It would seem to me that crawling headfirst through a tight passage into darkness isn't a natural thing. Like crawling up the side of a cliff for recreation, or jumping out of a perfectly good airplane and floating to the ground. We do these things to satisfy our hunger for adventure, this subconscious desire to conquer our own little Everest, as B is fond of saying. Caving is the last opportunity for exploration for the person with modest means. True. Just a short drive from just about anywhere in the country is a cave waiting to be explored. Even a cave that's well known can be approached by someone for the first time as an adventure. Many of you don't agree with my decisions to pursue this cave. I know this from the messages I've received, but I'm afraid I don't have a choice. If I'm ever to experience restful slumber again, I must return. If I'm ever to walk the halls of my home in peace, I must return. If I'm ever to exit the overworld and enter the subterranean world of a cave, I must now return. I don't feel like I have a choice. I must return. For my family and friends who are reading this, I say, be at peace. I will conquer this cave, and I will return to update the website immediately. I'll include any photos that were taken, and if you stop by the house, I'll show you the video I will have. I expect to be home later tonight, or tomorrow at the latest. See you all with a lot of answers. Love, Ted. And as you know, he never updated again. And that is the end of the Ted the Caver Creepypasta. I hope you enjoyed this chill little time. I hope you vibed with it very much. Maybe we'll be doing this in the future, probably with shorter creepypastas and scary stories because my voice is about to die. But again, thanks for joining me. I might re-upload this as a proper VOD with video and images, but we'll see. In any case, thank you for joining me, and I hope you take care. Bye-bye!